For years, the loudest message in the SAP ecosystem has been the obligation or the requirement to move from ECC to SAP S/4HANA. Do you have to do it? What are your options? That's what I want to talk about today. My name is Marcus Harris. I'm a software and technology attorney. For over 20 years, I have drafted and negotiated a variety of technology-related contracts and litigated failed software implementation projects in courts across the country. Migrating to S/4HANA isn't simple, despite what SAP might say. I think before you make the move, you really need to ask yourself, what value will S/4HANA create for your business? Is there a business case for it? What is it going to cost? I think you want to think about cost pretty expansively, not just the implementation of the S/4HANA software. You want to think about how much is it going to cost to operate that software system. You want to ask yourself, what risk does it actually reduce in your business? And what new risks might it introduce to your business? If you're going from an on-prem system to a cloud system, there could be specific concerns with data security, data integrity. You really have to think about these things. What alternatives exist that deliver outcomes that don't require you to rip out the old software and replace it with something new? Is there maybe a hybrid system that you can utilize? One example of a company that pushed back on an S/4HANA migration is Kingfisher. Kingfisher instead, what they decided to do is move their ECC environment to the cloud, and I think the value of a move like that really can be significant, and the reason why it matters is it preserves many of the organization's customizations that it has built over the years into that legacy SAP system, customizations that reflect specific operational needs. These are customizations that may be embedded with respect to the business operations that are unique to that company. It preserves historical data. It preserves reporting structures. And it keeps those integrations in place that are necessary for a business to run. So I think it can be a much more viable option if it's a right fit for you. The reality of it is that I think ECC, if in that kind of a scenario, is really treated like what it essentially is. It's a stable back office backbone that can remain in place while the company can put in APIs, add-ons, different layers of functionality to keep innovating, to keep a competitive edge, but you don't necessarily need to make some sort of substantive move to the cloud. One of the biggest risks and one of the biggest leverage points that I think SAP has is really trying to force these migrations by putting out arbitrary deadlines, sunsetting support in an attempt to force, essentially strong arm their customer base into adopting S/4HANA. And the leverage point really is the lack of your ability to get support. And I think it's really not true. And again, you can look to Kingfisher and the way that they address this. And what they did is they simply used a third-party service provider. I think in their scenario, they actually use Rimini Street, which is a company we know well here. Certainly a viable alternative, certainly an expert in the SAP field. So you don't have to buy into these arbitrary deadlines necessarily. And I think it certainly provides tremendous upside, right? You keep your customizations, you keep your old system. You don't have to engage in a costly implementation. You have some methodology for receiving continual support via a third-party vendor, and I think it really does extend the viability of your ECC system for years to come. Ideally, I don't know if that really is going to negate the need for you to at some point make the switch to S/4HANA or not, but at least you've got certainly a viable alternative. One of the other arrows in SAP's quiver to really force their customer base to adopt S/4HANA is really this threat that they are not going to innovate ECC anymore. So essentially, if you want to adopt the latest and greatest, you want new innovations, you want artificial intelligence, you want all the great things that SAP is promoting, you're only going to get that in S/4HANA. And the way that Kingfisher dealt with that specifically was that they pursued innovation using third-party AI vendors. So they got third-party best-of-breed AI solutions and layered them in with their ECC solution. So, I mean, you look at this and I think, it's not necessarily that these third-party solutions are better than what SAP is offering. I mean, the point is that you have the ability to still innovate. You have the ability to get value out of that EC system. You're not locked in. You don't need to believe the SAP threats, the arbitrary deadlines, the lack of innovation. There's still a pathway forward that you can adopt, and it can be a relatively viable pathway for you. One of the other things that Kingfisher did is they rebuilt the architecture around APIs, and rather than treating their ERP system as this monolithic backbone that everything has to orbit around, they really leaned into an API-driven integration approach. And what they did was they created a more modular environment where the ECC system sits at the core, and you've got all of these other composable pieces of functionality that are going to support the system. And so what was Kingfisher's rationale? Why didn't they want to make the switch to S4HANA? And reading publicly available information, news stories, you kind of can read between the lines, and really, the CTO was concerned that there was going to be this massive increase in cloud costs if they had gone with S4HANA, and reportedly it was on an order of magnitude that just made it hard to stomach. I think it was 12 to 20 times the cost of what they were spending currently, and that to them, just didn't make any sense. And I think most people would agree with that move. And while that may sound like an obvious strategy, what Kingfisher did, I mean, I think it really does get lost when you've got your software vendor really trying to push you to adopt the shiny new object, and you feel like you're going to be left out if you don't do that. But certainly, the Kingfisher example shows that there is a practical path forward that you can utilize your legacy system without really giving up a lot. But I think you've also got to be careful too. I mean, I think if you're going to have an ECC centered strategy, that can be smart, but that very well may not be the forever answer for you. I think you've got to look at third-party support certainly is going to have limits. Product roadmaps are going to change. Providers will consolidate over time. There's going to be regulatory and security expectations that legacy software just may not be able to meet. So I think this is a viable strategy. It's a viable option, but it certainly gives you some breathing room to make a better and more well-reasoned decision, instead of having essentially a gun put at your head and your vendor saying you've got to switch by this date certain. Now you give yourself some more time to make a well-reasoned move that's going to benefit your company, let you run your company the way it wants to, not dictated by the technology vendor, but dictated by your business needs. And that, to me, makes a lot of sense. If you have any questions about anything in this video or any of our other videos, feel free to reach out to us. Love to talk to you, get you pointed in the right direction. Thank you.